One of the biggest challenges for smart home automation is knowing if a room is empty. So for instance, if you've got a motion sensor and a smart light bulb in a room, then it's very easy to set up a rule within Home Assistant, for instance, to turn the light on when someone enters the room. But the problem with motion sensors like these is that they're no good for genuinely telling if a room is empty. Now, ESPresence offers a way around this by using base stations like these, for instance, to track wearables like these and these, for instance. And then you'll be able to tell which rooms people are in. By knowing where people are within the house, you'll know which rooms are empty, and then you'll be able to set up your automation rules to only turn lights out if the actual room itself is empty. An additional benefit is you'll be able to send targeted announcements for individuals to the correct room speaker. And you'll also be able to set up personalized rules for different people within a room. But how do you install and configure ESPresence to work with Home Assistant? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, before we install anything, it's actually best that I go over the requirements first, because you're going to need hardware which is going to be compatible with ESPresence. So starting with the actual base stations, and I'll include a link for this page in the description. These are the devices you'll be using to actually track Bluetooth low energy devices around the house, and you'll be placing a base station in rooms that you actually want to record where people are. So you don't want to be placing these in every room. I mean, transit rooms like hallways, for instance, usually somebody just walks into the room, walks straight back out, so a simple delay timer would do. Where someone's going to be spending a long period of time, you'll want to put a base station in. So there is quite a lot to actually choose from. The ones that I've particularly opted for are these ones here. So these are the ESP32 dev boards. Now, what appeals to me about these is that they've got a built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi chip. So I don't have to run RJ45 cabling all around the house. I can just simply connect them up to Home Assistant through Wi-Fi. But they've also got a USB port. Now what that means is that I can actually use that port to install the actual firmware, but also to actually power these devices. So they'll be running 24/7 off a mains connection, either to a USB socket that's built into the wall socket or through an actual adapter. The only thing to point out though is that when you buy these, they don't actually have any cases, so that's something you need to consider. Now, in order to install the firmware on one of these base stations, you'll need to connect it to a Windows computer through a USB cable. Now, if the device doesn't show up in Windows, chances are it's because the cable doesn't support data transfers. So you're going to need an actual suitable cable that will work with your actual base station. Now, what you use really depends on what type of device you've opted for. In my case, because I went for the ESP32 dev boards, these ones have got a built-in micro USB port, so I need a cable that's suitable for that. And what I opted for were these ones here. So as you can see, they've got a micro USB port at one end, which I can plug into the actual dev board. And then the other end is a Type A port that we've got. So that's compatible with the computer that I'll be using to actually install the firmware, but also with the actual sockets or USB adapters that I'll use to actually then power the actual dev board going forward. Now, if you're going to be using these ESP32 dev boards, well, as you can see, they're pretty exposed. Now, cosmetics aside, I wouldn't really want to be leaving something like that lying around the house because it's basically just prone to accidental damage. So it's best to get a case for them. Now, if you happen to have a 3D printer, which I don't, what you could do is go on Thingiverse here, for instance, just do a search for ESP32 case to actually find one that you could use. Now, what I did is I just went and did a search on eBay for somebody who was selling them. And what these particular boxes do is they've got one end cut out for the actual port and cable to fit through, and then you've just got the lid on top. So as you can see, you've just got your base box essentially, and then you've got a bit of ventilation. So the type that I went for in particular are these ones that say no GPIO pins, because if you look on the board there's a bit of polystyrene underneath, and that's there to protect the actual pins. Now, what we're doing doesn't require the use of those pins, so a case like that does make sense. Now, this particular one I've picked out happens to be somebody in the UK. So one thing to bear in mind is they might be pretty cheap to buy, but you'll probably end up facing, pretty high shipping costs if you're buying this overseas. So it's best to find somebody who's making these in your own country. But these particular ones, so far they're quite reliable. I mean, they do fit quite snugly, I must admit. They're a good design of box, I must admit. I haven't had any problems with them myself. But it's just something you want to bear in mind because, as I say, yeah, these to me, these are just too exposed. Not the sort of thing you just want to leave lying around. Now, aside from needing the base stations, you're also going to need something that those base stations can track. In other words, something that's on your person emitting Bluetooth low energy signals, what's referred to as beacons. Now, I'll include a link for this page in the description because it lists out a series of devices that are known to work with ESPresence, ones that will work but have got caveats, as well as ones that just don't work at all. So I would strongly recommend you check out this list before you either try and use a device you've already got, especially if you're thinking about purchasing a device to actually use with ESPresence, just to make sure that it's actually compatible in the first place. So just to give you an example, we've got ones that have got caveats. So this health tracker, for example, it can't be paired to the phone. It's one of these where in order for ESPresence to actually detect it, it has to be in an unpaired state to begin with. On the other hand, although there was a big update to ESPresence to give it much better support for Apple Watches, the big problem with that is that you need access to the iCloud keychain. And in order to be able to get that access, you actually need an Apple Mac. So, as I say, you really want to go through this list in fine detail, especially if you're thinking about purchase anything, just to make sure that the actual device will actually work with ESPresence. Now, in order to try and keep this video as short as I possibly can, I do have to make some assumptions. So for one thing, I'm going to assume that you've already got Home Assistant installed and that you've configured areas for your rooms for these base stations. The reason being is that when we do configure the base stations, we'll have to tell them which room they belong to, and that has to match up with what we've configured in Home Assistant. I'm also going to assume that you've already got an MQTT broker available. That's because that's what we'll be using to communicate with Home Assistant. Now, if you don't know how to install the Mosquito broker, for instance, I do have a video that actually covers that. Now, because we're actually going to be communicating with Home Assistant over the network, I'm going to have to make an assumption that either Home Assistant has a static IP address or it has an IP address reserved in DHCP. That's because when we configure these base stations, we need to tell it what IP address to actually communicate with, in which case we do need that IP address to always remain the same. And then one final assumption is that you've got some form of file editor that you can use to edit configuration files in Home Assistant, because we need to make changes within configuration files on Home Assistant to tell about these trackers. Now, the first thing that we'll want to do is to install a firmware on our ESP32 device. So you'll want to plug that into a Windows computer using a USB cable. Then you'll want to point a web browser to this web page here, and I'll leave a link for this in the description. But what I'm using here is Microsoft Edge. Now, the developer used to suggest that you use either Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome. Mozilla's Firefox wasn't compatible some time ago. It does seem to work now, so you might want to give that a try instead if you prefer Firefox. But through this web page, what we can do is to actually install the actual firmware without installing any software, potentially. So, for example, what we've got is a choice of flavor. So I'm using an ESP32 dev board, so I can leave this set to standard. Now, if you click on that drop-down menu, you can see there's some choices, including, for example, an M5 Atom. And what that refers to is the type of base station you've got. So there's an M5 Atom, for instance. So you'd probably pick that instead if you're using one of those devices. You've then got a choice of versions. By default, it will pick the latest version. But what you then want to do is just click on Connect. And you should then see your device show up in this pop-up dialog box. Now, if it doesn't, it could be because the USB cable that you've got doesn't support data transfers, or because you've got a problem with the actual device not working with Windows because it needs some drivers. So if I click on Cancel, for example, it actually comes up with a series of choices for actual drives that you can download for the different types of chips, for example. In my case, as I say, I'm using an ESP32 dev board. It works without any problems. I didn't have to install any additional software. So I'm just going to click on Connect. I'll select that device and then I'll click on Connect again. And then we've just got to wait until it brings up this dashboard here. So we've got a choice of Install ESPresence, or we can have a look at the logs in the console. So this is a completely new device that I've got here. So I don't have any other choice other than to basically install a fresh installation of ESPresence. So I'll click on that. I've got a choice here to erase the device. Now that might make a lot of sense when you get major updates to the software. So for example, just double checking, I think it was 3.10. When that came out, it introduced a lot of new features, and there was certain features went away as well. So I think when it comes to completely new devices, then yes, you'll probably want to erase the device just for the sake of it, just to make sure that there's nothing actually on that device at all. If this was an existing installation, you may not want to take that and keep the existing configuration. On the other hand, if it's a major update like it was for version 3.1, then it may make sense to just erase it anyway and just start afresh. Either way, the next thing to do is to click on Next, and then we'll click Install to confirm that we actually want to erase this device and install the software. Now, the problem is you might have an issue where it just won't be able to actually do this work. It seems to be 50-50, I find. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If that's the case, what you want to do is, if we go to have a look on this board here, just to the left of the actual USB port, there's a little button called Boot. Now, if what you find is that it doesn't actually do the installation, it just gets to the point where it doesn't look as though it's going to install anything, what you'll need to do is hold that boot button down and then tell it to start the installation. So as I say, it seems to be 50-50. I mean, I bought quite a few of these devices through Amazon. Sometimes they've just worked straight away. Sometimes I have had to hold down the boot button. So it really depends. Either way, we're just going to leave this to complete its installation. Now, once the installation is complete, you'll get this pop-up box here saying that the installation is complete. So we'll click on Next. It now wants the actual Wi-Fi details. So what you want to do is fill in what your SSID is for your actual network, followed by whatever your Wi-Fi password is, for example, and then click on Connect. Now, what it'll then do is it'll go off and try to actually connect to your Wi-Fi. Now, one thing I find is that sometimes it does actually get stuck and you end up in a situation where it's just stuck like that for a while. It does actually connect to the Wi-Fi, but it just literally just sticks for some strange reason. If that's the case, what you might want to do is just try refreshing the web browser, and that usually does fix it. Well, sure enough, the web page here was still spinning its wheels after a few minutes, so I ended up just refreshing the actual page. But the next thing to do is to actually configure this device so that it can talk to Home Assistant. So what we're going to do is click on Connect. We'll select our device and then click Connect again. Now, what you might find is that sometimes you don't get all four of these options. It's actually reaching out to the device to check if it's already got the software installed. Sometimes that doesn't exactly go to plan, and all you get is the original options, which were just install or logs and console. If that happens, sometimes what I find is if you just close the box, click Connect again and connect back up again, that sometimes resolves the issue. Oh, there you go. Now I'm actually back to square one. This is the sort of problem I was talking about. So see, I've only got a choice of two options, so I'll just close that and I'll try that again. So sometimes this solves the problem. So there you go. Sometimes you have to do maybe a hard refresh, Control F5, or sometimes you'll need to actually close the web browser, open it back up again. But either way, we want all four of these options so that we can actually connect to this device over the network. So the assumption is it's actually connected to your Wi-Fi, obtained an IP address through DHCP, and this computer that you're using here should actually be able to then reach that computer over the network. So if I click on Visit Device, sure enough, this has actually picked up its own IP address from the DHCP server, and my web browser is now connected to a little web server running on it. So what we need to do is not a great deal at this stage. We just want to do enough to get it to actually talk to Home Assistant. So the first thing I want to do is to actually change the room. So I'm just going to call this one Lab. So this is the room where you're going to be placing this actual base station into. The idea is that somebody walks past with a wearable device. It's decided that this is the base station it's closest to. That device has then decided it's actually in this room, what we've called here Lab. So that's how we're finding out what room devices are in. Now this needs to be a room that's already been created on Home Assistant itself. We're just putting a name of a room into the actual configuration here, but this has to exist on Home Assistant for Home Assistant to be in agreement. Next thing we need to do is to fill in the MQTT server details. So if you're allowing these devices to connect to an internal DNS server, which personally I don't, I'm trying to keep my smart home devices as separate from my main network as I possibly can, just like the FBI even are actually suggesting. So I can't use a fully qualified domain name. I'm going to have to give the actual IP address. For the port, I haven't changed it, so I can stick with the default one, which is 1883. And then we need to provide the username and password. Now, as with the actual video that I showed on how to actually install the MQTT broker, I deliberately set up a username and password that I would use for MQTT clients like this. In other words, an account that can log in to the MQTT broker, but certainly won't have admin rights, for example. So that's what you need to fill in here, the actual name and password that this device can then log into with. I'll just fill in my details here. All of those get blanked out or blocked out, so you can't see either or. You can still see the name of the actual IP address of the server plus the port, but the credentials will always be blocked out, even the username. Now, there are a lot of other settings that we can do in here, but at this stage my only interest is really just getting it to talk to Home Assistant. So what we're going to do is click on Save. You can see it just spins a bit up in the top there, and that's it. Next thing we do is to just then click on the Restart Device button here. That'll then restart the device with the actual configuration changes that we've applied, and it should then, once it's back up and running, connect to our MQTT broker. Now the next thing to do is to check that our base station is connected to the MQTT broker. So I'm on the overview dashboard. So this is the admin dashboard, and it should have all of the devices and entities that Home Assistant knows about. Unless you've actually changed any of the default settings, new devices should get automatically added into this dashboard. And sure enough, I've got a room called Lab, and it's now actually showing an ESPresence Lab device. So because it's saying it's connected, I do know this is actually working now, which is a good thing. Now, obviously, this is just a lab setup. Everything's sparse on this dashboard. So if there is quite a bit of clutter there, what you can do, for instance, is go to Settings, Devices and Services. And then we've got our Mosquito broker here, which has been installed. There's a link here for all of the devices that have been connecting to the Mosquito broker. Mine only has one, so when I click on this, it's going to take me straight to the actual device itself. But it gives you quite a lot of useful information, including logs and so on here. One thing to point out is that although this has got some configuration options, what I tend to find is that I can't really make use of it, to be honest, because if I make any changes here, I do still need to restart the device. Now, I'm not seeing any option within here to actually restart the device. Either way, I need to connect to the device. So I may as well make any configuration changes there. One easy way to do it, I mean, you don't necessarily have to go back to the main website. You can just click on this link that I've got underneath the actual device info block here, and that'll connect me to basically the same page that I was using before. It's exactly the same, because it's just reaching out over the network to connect to the little web server on it. So going forward, what I can do is, if I want to make further updates to the actual device itself, I'll just come here, click on that option there, make my changes, click Save, and then just restart the device. Then once it's back up and running, those changes will take effect. But at least now we know our actual base station has actually connected to the Mosquito broker, and also the fact that Home Assistant itself knows about it. Now our goal is to track Bluetooth wearables around the house, in which case we actually need to tell Home Assistant what to actually track. Now, how you do that really depends on the actual device you're using. So if you go back to this page, which discusses the actual beacons, there's various bits of information they'll tell you depending on the actual device. But for your typical beacon, it's a case of finding out what the actual MAC address is. This is the Bluetooth MAC address that it's using, and then we'll use that to find out an ID for the device that we can use in Home Assistant. Where you find that really depends on the device, but typically what you'll be looking for is an about page. So on this device that I've got, just a basic fitness tracker, at the moment it's not actually paired with anything. If I swipe down, it gives me an option for settings. If I select that, right at the bottom I've got an about page. If I select that, at the bottom it gives me a Bluetooth MAC address, and that's what I'm looking for. Now, what you want to do is note that actual MAC address down. It's usually separated out with 2 characters, and then there's colons in between. We don't want the actual colons, we just want the actual, all of the characters combined together. But we want to be able to actually identify that device based on that MAC address we've got, because then what we're going to do is to go to this web page here, which is going to connect us to the console of the actual device, the base station that we've got. So I'll include a link for this page, but as long as your ESP32 device is still plugged into your Windows computer, you can click on Connect, select the device, click on Connect, and then basically I'm just going to sit twiddling my thumbs for a while, and I'm just going to wait and watch for information about devices that are being detected through Bluetooth on this actual device to start showing up. When they do, what we'll get is an actual MAC address for a device plus an ID, and what we're interested in is the actual ID. So we're just starting to see information showing up. I mean, for security reasons, I've got to start blocking this sort of information out. I can't show you everything. But down here in this block here, we've got the MAC address of the device followed by what it shows afterwards. So in these cases, some of these are referring to I tags. You'll get different information back depending what those devices are. But that's what you need to be looking for, is keep an eye on these sort of blocks here. Match that up with the actual device that you've just taken the MAC address from, and then we'll be using the information on the right hand side to use in Home Assistant. So I'm just going to wait a while until my device starts showing up. Now I've been waiting for quite a while now, and there's just no sign of this device showing up in the list, and that can actually happen. But what we can do is to actually tell the base station about our device. In other words, we can supply it with the MAC address. Once we do, it should then start to show up in the list. Now, for security reasons, I can't show you what I'm seeing here, because I mean, some of these devices, they could belong to neighbours, there could be people who are passing by, standing outside the house, who knows. Bluetooth has quite a range on it. So what I can tell you though, and I'll show you an example, is that ESPresence is presenting these MAC addresses as just one big string. It's just basically numbers with lowercase letters, and that's what we want. So you would take the MAC address from your device, remove the colons, and that gives you what you need. But we have to present that to ESPresence in a suitable format. So it's got to be numbers and lowercase letters. So stick to that. I mean, I'll show you an example all the same, just to make it easier. But what we want to do is go to Home Assistant. We'll pick out our base station, then we'll connect to it through the network. And then we'll scroll down to here where it's got a field for known BLE MAC addresses. And what we can do is then actually paste the MAC address of a device into here. Now, as it says, if you're going to be placing multiple MAC addresses in this field, what you want to do is separate them out by a space. In other words, don't put a colon between them, just separate them out by a space. But you can have multiple ones here. It's better to try to get the actual ID from here and not do that. But in this case, as I say, I'm just not seeing it showing up, and that just can't happen. In which case, once I put my MAC address in, I'll click on Save. and then I'll restart the device. And then once that's back up and running, I should be able to actually see my device showing up in the list. Well, this is now rebooted and it's automatically reconnected through the actual console. And one thing I would point out is it's now actually found my device. So now that I've got an ID to match against the MAC address, what I can do is just literally highlight that ID and then copy it into the clipboard, and then I can use that to configure Home Assistant, because that's what we need. It's the actual ID. One thing I'll do is I'll provide you an example, but basically now what we get essentially is the MAC address that we actually told Home Assistant about, but it's got the word known with a colon in front of it. So the actual ID is pretty easy and obvious to spot, but all the same I still want to know what that is, just to be on the sure side. Well, now that we know the ID of the device we want to track, we can create a sensor in Home Assistant for it. So if you head over to this web page here, I'll include a link in the description for it. They do actually give you an example of how to actually set up a sensor. The only thing is they've actually got this in the main configuration.yaml file, and I like to separate things out. So go back to Home Assistant. Now I'm using Studio Code Server to handle my configuration files, or you can use something else. But I'm going to click on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hover over here and I'm going to tell it to create a new file. I'm going to call it mysensors.yaml. And then what I need to do is paste in the details of my actual device. Now, it's pretty much the same as what we've got here, except I don't have that sensor followed by a colon part. The rest is basically identical. I mean, we've got a device ID, and that's the ID that we took from the actual base station. So where they've got one that starts as iTrack : mine starts known : followed by the actual MAC address in this case. I've given it a name for the state topic. As you can see, it's set to ESPresence / devices / and then whatever that device ID is. So that's what we've got here. Then we've got our timeout now, a wait timeout. The wait timeout, incidentally, is how long it waits before it simply marks the device as being not home. So you can use that for not just your internal tracking, but also for external tracking, for example. Anyway, that gives you the example here, and we've created our file that contains details of this particular sensor. And like to show you in the example, you would just keep adding more and more of these sensors in for each device that you want to track. Now in this case, we've just got the one, so I'll just leave that as is. But I need to go back to my configuration.yaml file, and I need to actually tell it to include that file that we've just created. So this one, as you can see, is set to sensor. So that's what that part is up there. Bear in mind, you can only have one of each type associated with a file, so all of your sensors would end up in your mysensors.yaml file. All of your scenes should end up in scenes.yaml and so on. So now that we've done that and given it the details, I need to go over to Developer Tools. I'm just going to tell it to check the configuration just to make sure that Home Assistant's going to restart, because that's what we need to do. I'm then going to restart Home Assistant so it can actually take advantage of that information we've given it about our tracking device. So I'll click restart, then restart again, and then I'm just going to wait for Home Assistant to actually come back up again. Well, once Home Assistant is back up and running, you should find yourself with a sensor that represents your tracking device. So over here on the overview dashboard, in this sensor block, I've got a new sensor called David Fitbit, because that's what I actually configured the name as. And it's also telling me that this is actually in the lab. And that's because when I configured the base station, the room that I gave it was lab. The key thing to point out is that this name that we're seeing here for the room is all lowercase. So for Home Assistant, it has a capital L. For the actual base station, it has a capital L. But when you look at the actual sensor itself, it's all lowercase. So do bear that in mind when you're using these actual sensors in your rules. If you're doing any comparison to check what room the actual device is in, make sure you're doing checks against lowercase room names. In any case, what we can do, which is quite useful, is click on this device. If you select attributes, you can actually find out how far away this device is from this particular base station that it's being reported as closest to. One thing to bear in mind is that number is not an accurate number. It's saying it's 0.34 meters, and it can fluctuate, and it can fluctuate vary depending on the actual room. Signals can get blocked by the furniture, for example. It can also get blocked by yourself. You can have two beacons placed right next to each other, and you could end up with different results. So although that says 0.32 and it's supposed to be 0.31 meters, it's always based on the signal strength. Some devices might have a high signal strength, some devices might have a low signal strength. So these are things you need to factor in if you're going to have multiple devices. But either way, we've now actually got a device that we can track, albeit we've only got one base station. Now, obviously, for this to really work, you're going to need multiple base stations. So one for each of the rooms where you're expecting people to spend a reasonable amount of time. So what you'll want to do is to install the firmware and configure these devices similar to what we did for the first one. The only thing that you don't need to do is to actually go through that process of finding the actual ID of the device that we're tracking. However, if you are actually hard coding a MAC address, for instance, onto a base station, like I did with this example, you're going to have to put that same MAC address on all of the base stations that you've got so that they can all actually track that device. When it comes to the layout of these base stations, you want to try to keep them far apart, basically. You've got to take into account that the distance between them horizontally and vertically can have a bit of an impact. So, for example, if you've got two actual adjoining rooms, what you don't want is to have two of these base stations either side of an actual inner wall, basically. Otherwise, you're going to get too much overlap. Likewise, you've got to factor in that if you've got one room above the other, you don't want to be placing one actual base station on the actual ceiling when you've got a room above that with another base station nearby as well, because again, you're just going to get overlap. So what I do, for instance, is I place my actual base stations close to the actual outer wall as I possibly can get it, and then that way I've got a good coverage within the room and less likelihood of any overlap between two adjoining rooms. But once you've got multiple base stations set up, then you can actually start tracking devices as people move from one room to another. Now, once you've got all of your base stations configured and in place, you might find that you have to fine-tune things a bit, particularly if one of your actual beacons is jumping from one room to another. And to do that, you need to alter this maximum distance, which by default is set to 16 meters. Now, in order to find out what the ideal sort of distance is, what you can do is have a look on the actual track device and see what sort of distance is getting reported for that device from the base station. And then you can use that as your reference point. So, for example, in this case, we're seeing about 0.3 meters. So if I was reasonably comfortable with that distance being accurate, what I could do is set that to say 1 meter, save the changes, reboot the base station, and then if the device goes beyond that 1 meter distance, it'll stop getting actually reported as being in that room. So it helps to deal with these potential overlaps that you can get, especially when by default this is set up for 16 meter coverage. What I would suggest is to make sure you've got the Home Assistant app installed on a mobile phone, for example, or a tablet for that matter. It makes life a lot easier, because then what you can do is you can go to a room with that actual beacon that you've got, sit in a chair or stand in an area for quite a while, and then once that actual value starts to stabilize, then you can use that for your reference point. So that makes the life a whole lot easier for working out what sort of distance to use. Having said that, this particular value that you're going to see is going to vary depending on the type of beacon typically. Some might have a high signal strength, some might have a lower one. So that's something you need to bear in mind. So if you're going to have multiple beacons, do this for each individual beacon and then take away whichever happens to be the highest one getting reported. Set that as the maximum distance. And as I say, save the change, then restart the actual base station, and you should find that helps to stabilize that a lot better. So I've been running this for quite a while, and I must admit it is pretty stable, especially because of the sort of rules that I use in particular to try and iron these sort of problems out. But that's a good starting point really to fine-tune things. Now, since the release of version 3.0 of ESPresence, we've been given better support for Apple Watches. So whereas with some devices, you just need to know what the actual Bluetooth MAC address is, with an Apple Watch, we actually need to find out what the IRK is, the identity resolving key. And fortunately, you do get some details on how to actually do that, because if you come to this web page here about the actual beacons, there's a link here which takes you to the documentation to walk you through that actual process. Now, the first thing to point out is, as it says here, you're going to need the Apple Keychain application on macOS. So typically that means you need access to an Apple Mac to be able to do this. One other thing I'll point out is that it's saying here that you'll also want the Bluetooth MAC address to make things a bit easier. It's telling you to go to your Apple Watch, go to settings, then general, then info. On my watch, I had to go to settings, then general, then about. Another alternative is to actually open up the watch app on your iPhone, and in there you can go to general, then about, and it'll tell you what that Bluetooth MAC address is. So although we need the IRK, having that Bluetooth MAC address makes it actually easier to find the IRK. Now, in order to obtain the IRK for your Apple Watch, you want to open up Keychain Access, make sure that you've got iCloud selected, and then up here in the search field, type in Bluetooth to filter out the list. Then, as the documentation suggests, you want to look for entries that have got a GUID in them, a globally unique identifier. So in my case, I've actually got 3 to choose from. Now, what you're also then looking for is, on this line where it says account, you'll want an entry that actually has public in it. So this one says random, so we'll ignore that one. If you go to the next one, this one says public. For this, what you want to see is the MAC address of your actual Apple Watch. So in my case, that MAC address that I'm seeing does match what I've obtained for my actual watch, so I know this entry is good to use. Now, incidentally, what I've found is this entry that's lowered down has got public followed by the MAC address of my watch, then random, and then some random MAC address. Now, technically, it makes no difference. I could actually use either or, but I tend to find these ones easier to work with because there's less information in them. Now, another pointer is this one underneath Keychain says iCloud, and although you probably won't see it, this one actually says System. Either way, we're looking for the same information, the actual IRK. I just think these ones happen to be easier to work with. So once you've found the entry, double click on that. And then what you want to do is down here, select Show Password. I then need to authenticate. Now, sometimes you'll have to do that twice. It might ask you to put in your password and then your username and your password. Now, I'm on a remote session here to a Mac, so I don't have some easy shortcut, or at least one that I don't know of. But what I'm going to do is just click at the start of this line, because all I'm seeing is one line, but there's a lot more information than just that here. So by putting the mouse cursor there, I'm going to hold the mouse button down, the left mouse button to be specific. Hold that down, and I'm just going to drag the mouse until basically it's got all of the actual text highlighted. I'm then going to right click, select copy, go to my text editor, right click and paste. And then what we're looking for is the actual entry here where it says remote IRK. It's this particular data though that is the actual remote IRK. So that's what we want. Now we need to then actually convert this into something that's actually suitable for ESPresence to use. Now the next thing that you want to do is to copy this remote IRK, go back to documentation for ESPresence. If you scroll down to step 9 here, we've got a field where if we paste that into the field, click on Convert, it'll give us an output. This is what we actually want to use with ESPresence as base stations, as well as with Home Assistant. Well, now that we've got the IRK for our Apple Watch, we'll need to configure the base stations with it. Now, if you know what the IP address of the base station is, you can connect directly to it. Otherwise, through Home Assistant, you can go to Settings, then to Devices and Services. And then for the Mosquito Broker here, if you've got more than one device, when you click on this, you'll then have to choose the specific device that you want to connect to. In my case, we only set up one for this demo, so when I click on this, it'll take me directly to the actual base station that I've got. Either way, you'll want to then click on Visit, and it'll open up a new tab which gets you to the configuration page for that base station. Now, what we want to do is, under this scanning section here, where we've got a field for known BLE identity resolving keys, is to paste in that output that we got from the actual document for an IRK. So I'm just going to do that. Now, as it says, if you've got more than one of these devices, you'll want to separate them out by a space. I don't in this case, so I'm just going to click on Save. And then I'll click on Restart Device. Well, once you've configured your base stations with details about your Apple Watch, the next thing to do is to create a sensor for it in Home Assistant, and that involves editing a configuration file. So to do that, I'm going to go to Studio Code Server, so I'll click that, and then I'll select my file, and then what I need to do is to create a new sensor in here. So I'm going to go right to the end of this line, hit Return. Now, it's very fussy about the formatting, so I'm using the backspace to clear away any spaces that it creates, and I'm just going to paste in the actual details for this Apple Watch. The key things to point out when it comes to the differences between our original just health tracker that we set up before is that for this one we actually have to have IRK, then a colon, then what follows that is that output that we got from the documents page. It's the same for the actual state topic that we've got here. So while our health tracker was set up as being a known device and we give it the MAC address, here we've actually have to tell it this is an IRK that we're putting in here. So once we put in those details, I'll just close that file. We'll go to Developer Tools, check that Home Assistant should be able to start with those sort of changes we've put in. Then we'll click Restart, then Restart again, so that Home Assistant will then boot up with that new sensor information. Well, now that Home Assistant is back up and running, as you can see, we've now got a sensor which represents my Apple Watch. Now, obviously, this is reporting the actual watch as being in the lab, and not surprising really, because for this video, all I've done is set up one base station. But the key takeaway here is that as of version 3.0, ESPresence can not only track multiple beacons, it can also actually track multiple Apple Watches, even if they're running the same operating system version, and it couldn't do that before. So that's very useful if you've got several people within the house and they're all using an Apple Watch and they're all running the same version. This has been made much simpler doing that. It's a bit complicated having to set up the actual system to be able to get that IRK and actually then track the device by using that, but it is a big difference. Now, one thing I'll point out though is that I've got two devices here which basically are used to track my presence essentially. It isn't really practical, I'd say, to be doing that. It's better to have one wearable per person, because I could have the watch on me, for instance, and the actual Fitbit I could have left in another room, for example, to charge, in which case the system would get seriously confused if it's then reporting one as being in one room and one as in another. So yeah, I think it's probably better just to have one wearable. Now, going forward, what you can do with this is, well, entirely up to you really. From this information, you can actually work out which of your rooms are empty, for instance. By using that, you can then decide whether a room should have its lights or appliances turned off after a certain period of time. Because we know where people are in the actual house, in other words, which rooms they're in, you can then start to set up personalized automation for that individual in that specific room. So there's quite a lot of things you can do with this. It's not just a case of, you know, if a room's empty or not. you also know where actually individuals are within the house. So there's a lot you can do with this just by tracking a wearable device that's using Bluetooth. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, as that'll help get the video out to more people who might find it useful as well. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please post those in the comments section below. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yes, do subscribe. Just remember to set the bell icon to actually send you notifications when new content gets released, although I also post to Twitter as well as Facebook. If you'd like to help the channel and support it, you can actually make contributions through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. I've also got links to Patreon, and there's also the join membership option for YouTube itself. Patreon and YouTube members do have the option to actually benefit from early access as well. But above all, many thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.